The boarding announcement sliced through the ambient hum of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Daniel Briscoe, a man built with the quiet strength of a redwood, rose from his seat, a leather briefcase resting lightly in his hand. He moved with an unhurried grace, the kind born not of arrogance, but of a deep-seated self-assurance. Around him, the usual pre-boarding frenzy swirled, the impatient jostling, the last-minute phone calls, the anxious checking of tickets. But Daniel remained untouched by the chaos, his gaze fixed on the open doorway of Flight 237, his mind already miles away, tracing the contours of the case he was about to pursue in Philadelphia. He stepped into the narrow aisle of the plane, the familiar recycled air tinged with the faint scent of disinfectant and stale coffee. He found his seat, 12B, a window seat offering a sliver of the Texas sky. As he settled in, the subtle click of the seatbelt buckle anchoring him to the present. A woman bustled into the row, her designer handbag swinging like a pendulum. She stopped abruptly, her eyes, magnified by expensive lenses, scrutinizing Daniel with an intensity that bordered on hostile. Margaret Whitman, her name tag proclaimed. Her lips, painted a shade too bright for the morning light, thinned into a disapproving line. She clutched her boarding pass like a shield. The recycled air of the cabin hummed a monotonous tune, a low thrum that vibrated through Margaret Whitman's designer heels. Philadelphia. Finally, she adjusted the Hermes scarf around her neck, a subtle twitch that belied the simmering unease beneath her carefully constructed composure. The man beside her remained stubbornly still, a dark, impassive presence in a charcoal suit. Daniel Briscoe, his boarding pass had declared, an unremarkable name for such a disconcerting individual. His stillness unnerved her more than any fidgeting could have. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on the safety demonstration playing on the small screen embedded in the seatback ahead. His hands, large and tanned, rested loosely on his lap. They looked capable, too capable. The thought, unbidden and unwelcome, coiled in her stomach. She subtly shifted in her seat, putting a fraction more space between them. The leather creaked softly, a sound that amplified the silence between them. He didn't react, didn't even glance her way. Margaret's anxiety tightened its grip. His indifference felt deliberate, almost calculating. She took a slow, measured breath, trying to quell the rising tide of suspicion. This was ridiculous. She was being ridiculous. It was just a man on a plane. But the knot in her stomach remained. The world felt brittle, precarious, ever since everything had changed. The pre-flight announcements droned on, a litany of safety procedures she'd heard 1,000 times. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the bustling activity on the tarmac. Ground crew scurried like ants, their movements precise and hurried. Baggage carts weaved a complex dance around the plane. Beyond, the Dallas skyline shimmered in the afternoon heat. A city of gleaming glass and steel, a facade of order masking the chaos beneath. Just like this plane, just like this man. Such a shame about airport security these days, Margaret murmured, her voice carefully modulated, a practiced blend of polite concern and underlying tension. One can never be too careful. Her words hung in the air, a subtle probe, a fishing line cast into the murky waters of his silence. He didn't respond immediately. A flicker of something annoyance? Amusement? Crossed his face before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Margaret held her breath, every nerve ending alert. Finally, he turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. They were surprisingly intense, the kind of eyes that seemed to see right through you, stripping away the carefully constructed layers of social pretense. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. Indeed, he replied, his voice a low rumble, smooth as polished stone. Vigilance is essential. The ambiguity of his response only fueled her suspicion. What did he mean by essential? Essential for whom? For catching criminals? Or for avoiding detection? Her mind raced, weaving a tapestry of scenarios, each more outlandish than the last. He had to be something dangerous. The way he held himself, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. It all pointed to something. "So," Margaret began, her voice a touch too bright, a touch too eager. "Are you traveling for business?" The question felt loaded, heavy with unspoken implications. She held her breath, waiting for his reaction. His response, she knew, would be the key to unlocking the mystery of Daniel Briscoe. A flicker of what might have been a smile played at the corner of his lips. You could say that. The evasiveness was confirmation. It had to be. Why else would he be so cryptic? What business could possibly be so secretive that he couldn't even divulge its nature? Her mind conjured images of clandestine meetings, coded messages, shadowy figures lurking in darkened alleys. He shifted slightly in his seat, the movement almost imperceptible. But Margaret noticed. She noticed everything. It was a survival mechanism, honed over years of navigating the treacherous currents of high society. He was getting restless, uncomfortable. Perhaps he sensed her suspicion. Perhaps he was planning his next move. The cabin crew began their final checks, their movements brisk and efficient. The air crackled with anticipation. Soon, they would be airborne, trapped in a metal tube, hurtling through the sky. With him, panic clawed at the edges of her composure. She had to do something. Anything. She couldn't spend the next 3 hours trapped beside him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight with barely suppressed anxiety. "I need to speak to the flight attendant." She unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements jerky and abrupt. He watched her, his expression unreadable. As she stood, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. A flicker of what was it? Resignation? Amusement? Or something else entirely? Something colder. She pushed the thought away, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it. She had to get away from him. Now, she made her way to the front of the cabin, her mind racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She had to explain. She had to make them understand. The flight attendant, a young woman with a tired smile, listened patiently as Margaret poured out her concerns, her voice a frantic whisper. She spoke of suspicious behavior, of cryptic responses, of a gut feeling that something wasn't right. The flight attendant nodded, her expression carefully neutral. She promised to look into the matter, to ensure the safety of all passengers. Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she would be able to escape this predicament. As she turned to return to her seat, she saw him. He was standing in the aisle, talking to the flight attendant. He was showing her something small and rectangular. A badge. A flash of silver caught the light. FBI. The word echoed in her mind, a deafening roar that drowned out all other thoughts. FBI. He was FBI, and she had accused him, publicly, of being dangerous. The blood drained from her face, leaving her feeling cold and hollow. Humiliation burned in her throat, a bitter taste that threatened to choke her. She had been so sure, so certain, and so utterly, irrevocably wrong. The flight attendant's voice, soft and apologetic, reached her, as if from a great distance. He returned to his seat, his expression unchanged. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The silence between them was now thick with unspoken judgment, a heavy weight that pressed down on Margaret, suffocating her. The flight attendant, bless her professionalism, offered Margaret another seat with a quiet word. She took it numbly as shame burned in her chest, a dull ache far more profound than any physical pain. As the plane finally taxied onto the runway, Margaret stared out the window, the Dallas skyline now a distant blur. The world, once so clear and defined, now seemed shrouded in a hazy uncertainty. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a mournful dirge for her shattered assumptions, for the consequences of her unchecked biases. The recirculated air hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the frantic rhythm tapping against Margaret Whitman's sternum. The cabin doors had clicked shut, sealing them in her, the man, in this suffocating premonition. He sat beside her, an unsettling stillness radiating from him, a stark contrast to the turbulent disquiet churning within her. His suit, charcoal gray and impeccably tailored, did little to assuage her unease. It only amplified it, somehow. Why such formality on a midday flight to Philadelphia? Margaret shifted in her seat, the leather cool against her skin, a fleeting, unwelcome reminder of the price she'd paid for this upgrade. She adjusted the Hermes scarf around her neck, a nervous tic she'd developed long ago, a silent armor against the uncertainties of the world. He hadn't even glanced her way. His gaze was fixed on the safety demonstration, his dark eyes, sharp and observant, absorbing every detail. Like a predator, she thought, her pulse quickening. A predator studying its prey. No, no, Margaret chided herself internally. That's ridiculous. He's just a man. But the thought, once planted, refused to be uprooted. It burrowed deep, feeding on her anxieties, twisting them into grotesque shapes. He reached into his briefcase, retrieving a file. Margaret's breath hitched. A file? What kind of file? Government documents? Secret plans? The scenarios whirled in her mind, each more outlandish than the last. Her unease morphed into a tangible dread. She needed to do something. Anything. Excuse me, she began, her voice trembling slightly, a betrayal of the carefully constructed facade of composure she usually presented to the world. He turned, his expression unreadable, those dark eyes now fixed on her. A shiver ran down her spine. He raised an eyebrow, a silent invitation to continue. Margaret swallowed, the words catching in her throat. I just don't feel comfortable. His gaze didn't waver. Is there something I can do? He asked, his voice a smooth baritone, a disconcerting counterpoint to the turmoil raging within her. Well, it's just, Margaret stammered, her carefully crafted world of order and predictability crumbling around her. She couldn't articulate her fear, the insidious suspicion that whispered in the back of her mind. It was irrational, she knew, based on nothing but his appearance, his quiet demeanor, the inexplicable file. But the fear was real, nonetheless. I'd prefer if you could move. A flicker of something annoyance? Amusement? Crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Move, he repeated, his tone neutral. Yes, Margaret insisted, her voice gaining a shrill edge. To another seat. Anywhere else. I'd feel much safer. He tilted his head, studying her, his silence more unnerving than any answer could have been. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a desperate need to escape his scrutiny, to break free from this suffocating pressure. I'm sorry, ma'am, he finally said, his voice still calm, but I'm afraid that's not possible. This is my assigned seat. A wave of frustration washed over Margaret. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People like him were supposed to comply, to shrink back, to disappear. Not this. This quiet defiance. But I'm uncomfortable, she exclaimed, her voice rising. Heads began to turn. A flush of shame crept up her neck. She hated being the center of attention. But the fear, the irrational, consuming fear, overrode everything else. I understand, he said, his tone softening slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. Perhaps you could speak to a flight attendant? They might be able to find you another seat. Margaret grasped at the suggestion, a lifeline in the swirling chaos of her anxiety. Yes, a flight attendant. She pressed the call button, her finger lingering on it, as if the small act of summoning help could somehow dispel the unease that clung to her like a second skin. The flight attendant arrived, her smile strained as she took in the scene. Is there a problem, ma'am? Yes, Margaret blurted, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't feel safe sitting next to this gentleman. The flight attendant's smile faltered. She glanced at Daniel, then back at Margaret. Is that so? Yes, Margaret reiterated, her voice trembling again. He has a file, and he's just I don't trust him. The flight attendant's gaze flickered to the file in Daniel's lap. He met her gaze, his expression still unreadable. A tense silence filled the air, punctuated only by the low hum of the plane's engines. Margaret held her breath, every nerve ending on high alert. This was it. This was the moment. He would be removed. She would be safe. Daniel sighed, a quiet, almost imperceptible sound. He opened the file, revealing not the sinister documents Margaret had imagined, but a standard-issue FBI badge. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm Special Agent Daniel Briscoe, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I assure you, there's nothing to be concerned about." The blood drained from Margaret's face, leaving her pale and shaken. The air rushed from her lungs. The whispers around her, the curious stares, felt like a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, her carefully constructed reality shattering into a million pieces. She stammered, trying to form words, but nothing came out. Humiliation burned hot in her throat, choking her. The flight attendant, her face a mask of professional composure, offered to find Margaret another seat, but Margaret just shook her head, unable to speak, unable to meet anyone's gaze. She retreated into herself, a shell of her former confident self, the weight of her prejudice crushing her from the inside. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of shame and regret. The quiet hum of the engines became a mocking lullaby, a constant reminder of her unfounded fears and the devastating consequences of her unchecked biases. The cabin air, recycled and subtly stale, pressed down on Margaret Whitman like an invisible weight. The hum of the engines, a constant thrumming presence since takeoff, now seemed to mock her, a soundtrack to her utter humiliation. The crisp white linen of her Hermes scarf felt suddenly like a branding iron against her skin. Her throat constricted, each swallow a painful reminder of the dryness that had overtaken her mouth. Just moments ago, she had been a woman of consequence, a woman who commanded respect, or at least a cautious deference. Now, she was a spectacle. Daniel Briscoe sat beside her, a quiet monument to her folly. The same stillness that had irritated her moments before now radiated a chilling composure. He'd returned his gaze to the window, the Dallas cityscape shrinking below, now replaced by a blanket of clouds. His profile, sharp against the ethereal light, seemed to possess an almost sculpted quality. He appeared utterly unmoved, as though the incident had been nothing more than a minor turbulence in an otherwise smooth flight. Margaret's internal monologue raged. How could he be so calm? Doesn't he realize what he's done? He's made a fool of me, in front of everyone. The thought stung, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. Around them, the subtle murmur of the cabin had returned, but it was a different kind of murmur now, laced with a current of suppressed amusement. Margaret could feel the weight of their glances, the prickling sensation of being dissected, analyzed, and ultimately judged. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the plush fabric of her seat, to become invisible. But the confines of the aircraft, the inescapable proximity to the other passengers, made escape impossible. The flight attendant, a young woman with a carefully composed smile, reappeared. "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused, ma'am," she said, her voice soft yet firm, directed at Margaret. "Is there anything I can get you?" The offer, meant to be conciliatory, only fueled Margaret's simmering resentment. Inconvenience? This isn't an inconvenience. It's a public execution. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but the remnants of her social conditioning held her back. Instead, a choked "no, thank you" escaped her lips. The attendant nodded, her eyes holding a flicker of something Margaret couldn't quite decipher. Pity, perhaps? Or was it thinly veiled amusement? The uncertainty gnawed at her. The attendant moved on, her presence a lingering reminder of Margaret's public downfall. Margaret's mind raced, replaying the moments leading up to her humiliation. The initial suspicion, the escalating anxiety, the unwavering certainty that she was in danger. Now, viewed through the lens of her exposed prejudice, each step seemed ludicrous, a testament to the insidious power of unchecked assumptions. He was just sitting there, quiet, minding his own business. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her fear, her suspicion, it had all been a fabrication, a product of her own ingrained biases. A wave of nausea swept over her. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the sickening realization of her own flawed judgment, the understanding that she had acted on prejudice, not fact. She risked a glance at Daniel. He remained engrossed in the view outside, seemingly oblivious to her inner turmoil. The silence between them stretched, taut with unspoken tension. "Two," Margaret stammered, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo the damage. But what could she possibly say? "I thought," she began again, her voice barely above a whisper. The words trailed off, lost in the ambient hum of the aircraft. Daniel finally turned, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held a depth that made Margaret's heart sink. He didn't speak immediately, the silence amplifying her discomfort. Finally, in a low, steady voice, he said, "I investigate actual threats for a living, ma'am." The statement, simple yet potent, hung in the air between them, a stark reminder of the absurdity of her accusations. The blood drained from Margaret's face. His words weren't accusatory, not even remotely angry. They were simply a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling calmness that cut deeper than any outburst could have. Actual threats. The phrase echoed in her mind, a stark contrast to the phantom threat she had conjured from her own prejudices. It was a misunderstanding," she mumbled, the words feeling hollow, even to her own ears. The excuse, weak and pathetic, did nothing to alleviate the burning shame that consumed her. She wanted the earth to swallow her whole. She clutched her Hermes scarf tighter, the expensive fabric offering no comfort, only a reminder of the superficiality of the image she had so carefully cultivated. Daniel's gaze lingered for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the window, the conversation, and seemingly the incident concluded. Margaret was left to stew in the silence, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with suffocating force. The remainder of the flight stretched before her, an interminable expanse of time in which she could do nothing but confront the ugliness of her own prejudice. The hum of the engines, once a background noise, now seemed to throb in time with her pounding heart, a constant reminder of her public humiliation. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, mirroring the vast, uncomfortable expanse of her own internal landscape. She closed her eyes, wishing desperately for the flight to end, for the chance to escape the suffocating confines of the aircraft and the even more suffocating prison of her own making. The hum of the plane vibrated through Daniel's frame, a low thrum against the quiet classical music playing through his noise-canceling headphones. He'd barely registered the woman settling into the seat beside him, more focused on the faint ache in his left shoulder, a lingering souvenir from a training exercise gone wrong. Outside, the world was a canvas of unbroken white, the clouds a thick, undisturbed blanket beneath the piercing blue. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the flight lull him into a state of near meditation. Peace, however fleeting, was a precious commodity. He felt a shift in the air beside him, a subtle stiffening, a nervous energy that seeped into his carefully constructed calm. He opened his eyes slowly, his gaze settling on the woman next to him. She was clutching her designer handbag, her knuckles white against the expensive leather. Her eyes, magnified by her glasses, darted between him and the aisle, a flicker of something unsettling in their depths. He couldn't place it. Fear? Disgust? He met her gaze for a fleeting moment, a neutral, polite acknowledgement, then returned to the window, the endless expanse of clouds a welcome distraction. Her perfume, heavy and cloying, invaded his space, a suffocating presence that mirrored the growing tension emanating from her. He could feel her gaze on him, the weight of it heavy and uncomfortable. He adjusted his position, trying to subtly create more distance, but the confines of the plane offered little escape. Just ignore it, he told himself, his inner voice calm and measured. It's a long flight. Just ignore it. But the silence, punctuated by the woman's agitated breathing, became thicker, more oppressive. He heard her rustle in her seat, the faint crinkle of plastic, and then the distinct click of a call button. He knew, with a certainty that came from years of honed instincts, that this was about him. He kept his gaze fixed on the clouds, his heart beating a steady rhythm against the rising tide of irritation. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. The flight attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile, arrived at their row. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" The woman's voice, when she spoke, was tight with barely suppressed hysteria. "You don't feel safe. I'd like to move seats." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The flight attendant's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. She glanced at Daniel, her expression questioning. He met her gaze, his own steady and unreadable. He could feel the weight of the woman's accusation pressing down on him, the insidious nature of it twisting in his gut. He knew what she saw, a man of color, dressed in a suit that, despite its impeccable tailoring, couldn't erase the ingrained prejudices that colored her perception. He'd seen this look before, the subtle tightening of the lips, the averted gaze, the unspoken fear masked by feigned politeness. It was a familiar dance, one he was weary of performing. "I'm afraid the flight is full, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice strained. "There are no other available seats." The woman's face flushed, a mottled red creeping up her neck. But I can't sit here. Just can't." The unspoken accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The passengers in the surrounding rows were beginning to stare, their curiosity piqued by the rising tension. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, assessing, judging. He took a deep breath, the controlled exhale a small victory against the rising tide of anger. He knew he had to speak, to break this suffocating silence. He turned to the woman, his voice low and even. "Is there a specific reason why you can't sit here?" The woman flinched, her eyes darting away from his gaze. Just don't." He pressed further, his voice still calm, but with a steel edge that betrayed his growing impatience. "Perhaps you could explain why. It would help the flight attendant understand your request." Her face crumpled, her composure finally shattering. You make me uncomfortable." The words were barely a whisper, choked with fear and prejudice. The air in the cabin thickened, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the plane. Daniel felt a flicker of something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd had enough. He reached into his jacket, his movements deliberate and slow, and pulled out his FBI credentials. He held them up, the small, gold badge gleaming in the cabin light. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still low, but now laced with authority. "I assure you, I'm not a threat. I'm an FBI agent, on my way to Philadelphia on official business. Perhaps you can explain to me, and to my colleagues when we land, exactly why my presence makes you uncomfortable." The woman's face drained of color, her eyes widening in disbelief. The blood rushed from her cheeks, leaving her pale and shaken. The carefully constructed facade of her composure crumbled completely, revealing the ugly truth of her prejudice. She stammered, her words incoherent, her eyes darting between his face and the badge. The whispers around them intensified, the other passengers now openly staring, their expressions a mixture of shock and disgust. He tucked the badge back into his jacket, his gaze holding hers. The silence stretched, taut, and unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but resonant with power. "Do better." The words hung in the air, a stark indictment of her behavior, a challenge to examine her own biases. The woman mumbled an apology, her voice barely audible, her shame palpable. Daniel turned back to the window, the endless expanse of clouds suddenly seeming less appealing. The weight of the encounter settled on him, a heavy cloak of weariness. He closed his eyes, the hum of the plane a dull throb against the silence in his mind. He hoped, with a weary resignation, that she would, indeed, do better. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a gentle thud, the subtle tremor rippling through the cabin of Flight 237. The muted roar of the engines began to subside, replaced by the whirring and clicking of machinery as the plane taxied towards the gate. Margaret Whitman felt the familiar lurch in her stomach, not entirely from the descent, but from a lingering unease that had taken root and blossomed throughout the flight. She kept her gaze fixed on the seat in front of her, the gray fabric of blurry canvas upon which her shame was projected. She hadn't dared to look at the man beside her since the incident. The FBI badge, the quiet authority in his voice, the ripple of shocked whispers that had followed her outburst, it played on repeat in her mind, a constant reminder of her own prejudice, laid bare for all to see. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her designer handbag, the expensive leather offering no solace. She had boarded this flight with an air of superiority, the carefully curated ensemble, the first-class ticket a testament to her perceived status. Now, all she felt was a profound sense of smallness, a shrinking within herself, a desperate wish to disappear into the anonymity of the crowd. Outside, the Philadelphia skyline emerged from the afternoon haze, a jagged silhouette of steel and glass against a muted sky. The city, with its history and promise, held no allure for her at this moment. All she could think of was the escape, the anonymity of a taxi, the sanctuary of her hotel room. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just about the humiliation, though it burned like acid in her throat. It was about the uncomfortable truth that had been forced upon her, a truth she had spent years carefully avoiding. The man she had so readily judged, the man she had deemed a threat based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the cut of his suit, was a protector, a guardian, the very embodiment of the law she claimed to uphold. The plane slowed to a stop, the finality of the movement mirroring the finality of her humiliation. A collective sigh swept through the cabin as passengers began to gather their belongings. The subtle clinking of buckles, the rustle of bags, the murmured conversations, these sounds, usually so mundane, now grated on her nerves. Each noise felt like a pointed reminder of her exposed prejudice, a public condemnation. Margaret remained seated, frozen in place. She watched, as if through a distorted lens, as other passengers filed past. Some avoided her gaze, others offered fleeting, pitying glances. She couldn't decipher their expressions, but the unspoken understanding hung heavy in the air. They had witnessed her prejudice, her unfounded fear, her utter foolishness. And in their silence, she heard a judgment far more damning than any words could have conveyed. Daniel Briscoe, the man she had wronged, stood up, his movements smooth and unhurried. He adjusted his jacket, the same dark suit that had initially fueled her suspicion, now a symbol of her own misjudgment. He didn't look at her, didn't offer a word, but the absence of acknowledgement was more cutting than any reprimand. It was a silent dismissal, a quiet confirmation of her insignificance. He picked up his briefcase, a simple, elegant piece that spoke of a life lived with purpose and integrity, a life so starkly different from the superficial existence she had carefully constructed for herself. He paused momentarily, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window, perhaps the city, perhaps his own thoughts, and then he was gone, swallowed by the throng of disembarking passengers. The cabin was almost empty now, the air thick with the residue of her shame. Margaret finally unbuckled her seatbelt, the click echoing in the near-empty space. She stood on shaky legs, feeling the weight of her handbag, the weight of her humiliation, the weight of the realization that her prejudice had been laid bare for all to see. As she made her way down the aisle, the flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile, offered a polite, "Have a nice day, ma'am." The words, meant to be a pleasantry, felt like a cruel irony. Margaret could only manage a weak nod, her throat constricted with unshed tears. Stepping onto the jet bridge, the cool air of the terminal washed over her, offering no relief. She walked towards baggage claim, a ghost amidst the bustling crowd, each step a heavy echo of her own internal turmoil. The lesson had been brutal, public, and unforgettable. She had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that the assumptions we make about others, the prejudices we harbor, the fears we allow to fester, can ultimately expose us, not the people we judge. And in that exposure, we reveal not the flaws of others, but the ugliness within ourselves. The world, she realized, wasn't black and white, neatly divided into categories of us and them. It was a complex tapestry of individuals, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own truths. And sometimes, the quietest among us carry the greatest strength, the deepest wisdom, and the power to expose the darkest corners of our own souls.